Pulitzer Prizes, I want to hear about the return of my investment. I invested in that company not because they do journalism, but because they're giving me a good return on my investment. And what's the goal of a publicly traded company? Not competition, monopoly. Right? To eliminate competition. You can talk to any publisher. Their goal is to eliminate the competition. And it's up to the Justice Department to prevent that from happening. And the Justice Department has pretty much disappeared in the last 30 years. The Justice Department does very little in terms of antitrust litigation in the area of media. So what you end up with is big companies swallowing up smaller companies, and it goes on and on and on. And to the point where we're at now, most media conglomerates that own most of the newspapers and most of the radio stations and most of the TV stations, they're now owned by so few companies that the CEOs of those companies could fit in this room. Fit in this room. There are fewer than 25 companies that own almost all the newspapers, magazines, TV, cable, and so on and so on. So you talk about a tremendous concentration. And that's not to say these are bad people. It is to say that their motives, their motivation is very different than the motivations that it might be if you didn't have to worry about quarterly reports and growing your company, which is what accounts for the value of a stock. It's not simply making profit. Right? I want to see a bigger company next quarter. Not simply a company that's giving me a good return on my investment. I want to see a company that's growing. So I wouldn't be surprised if in the years to come we see not only consolidation with the high-tech firms, Google and Facebook and Twitter and so on, but I could see them purchasing newspaper companies as well, despite the fact that Google insists it doesn't do journalism. But they may find those platforms valuable and economically useful for them. Anyway, there's nothing to prevent that from happening, is my point. We don't have much in the way of public policy in this area, in part because publishers and corporate executives argue against any policy. Right? And any policy is a contradiction of their allegiance to the marketplace, which is what they. When I was teaching at the Stanford campus in Oxford in the 1990s, Rupert Murdoch was invited to campus to speak. Tremendous security. He's a controversial figure there as he is here. And his entire speech was a plea to the British government to leave him alone. Leave him alone. They were threatening him with regulation, and he used Oxford as an opportunity to say, freedom of the press means I get to do what I want to do, which is exactly the argument he's making now in Washington, D.C., because he's thinking about purchasing the LA Times. And he can't because he owns major radio and TV stations in the LA area. He's going to need an exemption from the FCC. And he may get it. I wouldn't be surprised.
This was Oxford for credibility.
Absolutely.
Of his argument.
Prestige and status.
They were either bought or hoodwinked.
Yeah, I mean, things that seemed unthinkable. I mean, I have the worst crystal ball of them all. I remember telling people, there's just no way in the world the Wall Street Journal is going to sell itself to Rupert Murdoch. It's just not going to happen. And it happened. Right? I would have never expected the Knight Ridder newspaper chain to disappear. It did. I mean, these things are highly unpredictable. And the Bancroft family, who owned the Wall Street Journal, Murdoch made a tremendous offer and made promises. It turned out to be a series of lies. It made promises about the editorial autonomy and independence of the Wall Street Journal. He backed down from them almost within a year. Well, what can you do? It's his newspaper. You sue him for breach of contract, I guess.
In television, he owns Fox, right?
That's right. Fox is
Fox.
his. Yes.
Fox, so he owns
New York Post. He owns HarperCollins. I mean, it's a long, long list of what he owns. And not just in the United States, but in Australia and Britain, around the world. I mean, increasingly, these are global conglomerates. I mean, you can't talk about U.S. companies anymore. Is Google a U.S. company, or is Google a global company?
What would you say the role of ethics in this digital era? That everything is so fast, and the media is competing, like to be the first instead of to be accountable or responsible or ethic.
It's mind-numbing. What I hear increasingly from my friends at the Daily and elsewhere is there's this confusion about etiquette and ethics. I've heard a number of people argue that this is the way it's done. That's simply the way it's done. It's the etiquette. Therefore, it's the right thing to do. It has to do with anonymity. It has to do with retweeting a tweet. Well, it wasn't mine. I just passed it along. But when it's passed along from a reporter, does that confer certain status on it? There's a confusion about what's posted, what's public, and what's published. The fact that it's posted, does that mean it's public? The fact that it's public means it should be posted. The fact that it's posted means it should be published. Are those not discrete judgments? But I've heard any number of journalists argue, oh, we need to publish it because it was already posted. So there's tremendous confusion about authority. There's tremendous confusion about the relationship between things. There's tremendous confusion about the roles and responsibilities of the press today as opposed to the press 5, 10 years ago. When you think of the controversies surrounding what's in the press and what becomes permanently in the press. It didn't matter, 10 years ago, it didn't matter if there was an obscure story about you that wasn't terribly flattering 40 years ago because no one was going to dig it up. You know, the chances of anyone seeing it were very, very slim to non-existent. You didn't need to worry about it. Now, all of a sudden, given the way Google and other search engines work, you know, that obscure story could be the first hit on a Google search. And there's no way for you to walk away from it. Try calling up a newsroom and saying, take that down. They don't even have policies in this area yet. Take that down. The Stanford Daily is just now creating a digital archive. And we're beginning to talk about what happens when an alum from 1942 calls up and says, that was an inaccurate story that the Daily ran back in 1942. It portrayed me in a false light. I was glad to see that the only people who would have access to that story were the people going to the Stanford Library and looking at the Daily on a microfilm. Now, all of a sudden, anyone around the world can see that story. It does damage in ways they would have never anticipated in 1942. What's a reasonable response on the part of the newsroom? Do they take it down and deny the Stanford Daily its role as providing a permanent record of what happened in 1942, what was published in 1942? Do they put a little box alongside it that says, we apologize for the error? Or do they correct it in some way? I don't know how that's going to play out, but it's a frightening new world in the sense that things will come back to haunt us in ways we never anticipated. Journalism has powers that no one anticipated. The powers of making something not only public, but public in a permanent way. I mean, students are beginning to realize that now with their Facebook setting. The sense, but even now when you talk to undergrads, often their sense is that Facebook really isn't public, it's social. As though that's a meaningful difference. The difference between what's social and what's public. And you know, I mean, that's a distinction we're struggling with at the university conceptually. What's the difference between social media and public media? But clearly Facebook is public enough to be concerned with the public consequences of what are taken to be social posts. You know, and the fact that, you know, once a photograph is up, it's up. You have no way of controlling it at that point. You have no way of taking it and having somebody reposting it 1,000 times. And all of a sudden what you thought was social becomes conspicuously public.
Any more questions?
Yeah, one more. Since talking about public, Yahoo, for example, just hired a software group to summarize the news and have it all presented in a conglomerate kind of way. That would make it more dangerous, wouldn't it?
I don't know, Yahoo's had its own, unlike Google, Yahoo has its own news team. They were doing some original news. You know, the problem with aggregation sites and the problem with Google is that it's not clear who accepts responsibility for what gets posted. Google wants to argue that it's the phone company. They're a common carrier, right? That they shouldn't be held responsible for what gets posted. They deny that they do news because they're in a position to deny us access to their algorithm. Buried in that algorithm, which I obviously haven't seen, but buried in that algorithm are journalistic judgments about sources, about newsworthiness, about the authority of other platforms like the New York Times and the Washington Post. I mean, they don't simply aggregate things in a random way. They aggregate things in a meaningful way. And the meaningfulness of their aggregation is an act of journalism, I would argue. And that's buried in an algorithm that they will not disclose, therefore they cannot be held accountable for. So at least Yahoo is a little more forthcoming when they acknowledge that they do journalism. Google is completely off the map in the sense that they deny they even do journalism. So we can't talk to them about something they don't do. So I don't know how that's going to play out. I do know that Google, to this day, will not even come to campus and talk about their algorithm. They're certainly not going to disclose it publicly. And I understand that. It's like Coca-Cola, right? Sharing their magic recipe for Coke. That's their trade secret. But when journalism deals with trade secrets, you can't have a serious conversation about accountability. You can't have it both ways. I mean, if the New York Times was to say our editorial judgment, and they do sometimes say this by implication, if you were to say our editorial judgments are a trade secret, then that's the end of the conversation. Not much we can talk about.
Let's thank the speaker one more time.
Thank you for having me.